Shadows at the gate. The snow fell in thick, silent sheets, blanketing the streets and alleys of the city in an unbroken layer of white. Under the glow of flickering street lamps, the snow glittered like tiny shards of glass. The wind cut through the air with a ferocity that made windows tremble in their frames and set bare tree branches clattering like bones. At the edge of one such alley, two figures huddled beneath a cardboard lean-to, their breath visible in the frigid air. Twin girls, no older than 8, sat curled together in the shadows, their bodies pressed tight for warmth beneath tattered coats barely thick enough to block the wind. One of the girls, the older by 3 minutes, held a threadbare scarf over both their heads, trying to shield them from the snow that drifted down through the cracks above. "We can't sleep here again," Nessa, the younger twin, whispered, her voice trembling, both from cold and from fear. "Vanessa." Nessa, to her sister, pulled her closer, feeling how sharply her sister's bones jutted beneath her too thin sweater. "We'll find somewhere," she whispered back, her voice fierce with a kind of protective defiance far too old for her years. "We always do." It had been 16 days since they'd last seen their mother. 16 days since the door to their one-room apartment was kicked in by a man in a navy suit, his voice cold and impersonal as he handed their mother a final notice. They didn't understand all the words: eviction, non-payment, legal obligation, but they understood the look in their mother's eyes when she told them to wait outside. They had waited. All day, all night, and when morning came, there was no sign of her. Nessa didn't cry that morning. She took her sister's hand, and they walked away. In the time since, they had survived on scraps. Half-eaten sandwiches found in park trash bins, crusts of bread offered by the rare kind passerby. Most people averted their eyes. The twins had become invisible, cold ghosts drifting along the edges of a city too busy to notice. Tonight was different. Tonight, the air was alive with music and light. Across the street, behind tall black iron gates, stood a mansion that looked like something from a storybook. Warm golden lights spilled from tall windows, illuminating wreaths and garlands draped across the balcony and doorways. Music drifted through the air, the cheerful notes of a string quartet playing carols. Beyond the gates, waiters in crisp uniforms carried silver trays piled with food that made the twins' stomachs ache with longing. The mansion seemed like a castle, the kind they used to dream about when their mother told them bedtime stories about brave princesses and kind-hearted kings. That food, Lily, the younger twin, licked her cracked lips, her green eyes locked onto a passing waiter balancing a silver platter of puff pastry and smoked salmon. Do you think they'd give us some if we asked?" Nessa's grip tightened on her sister's hand. "Rich people don't help kids like us." But Lily's hunger overpowered her fear. Before Nessa could stop her, Lily stepped out from the shadows, her worn sneakers crunching softly in the snow as she made her way to the gate. Nessa's heart pounded, the old terror rising in her throat, the terror of being seen, of being chased away, of being reminded how little they mattered. But she couldn't let her sister go alone. Gritting her teeth, she followed. The gate was taller up close, at least twice Nessa's height, and adorned with wrought iron swirls that made her think of frozen vines. Through the bars, they could see chandeliers the size of cars sparkling above guests in glittering gowns and tailored suits. It was a world so far removed from their own it might as well have been a dream. Lily lifted a trembling hand and tapped gently on the iron bars. Nothing happened. She tried again. Still nothing. "Hello," she called, her voice too small, swallowed by the wind and the music. "Please, we're hungry." Her voice cracked on the last word, and Nessa hated how small and helpless they sounded. But before she could pull her sister back into the safety of the shadows, a flashlight beam cut through the falling snow, blinding them both. "Move along," barked a voice. A guard in a dark coat, with a too-tight cap pulled low over his eyes, approached the gate. "No handouts. No loitering." "We're just hungry," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "Please." The guard sneered. Not my problem. His gloved hand reached for the latch to close the small pedestrian gate, locking them out permanently. Wait, Nessa said, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. Just a piece of bread. Anything. The guard didn't soften. He shook his head, already turning away when a new voice, low, commanding, and unmistakably powerful, cut through the night air. Let them in. The guard froze. Nessa and Lily froze. The voice came from the balcony above the grand entrance. A man stood there, silhouetted by the light from the house behind him. Even from this distance, there was something about him, the way he stood, the authority in his voice, that made the very air around him feel heavier. The guard faltered. Sir, they're just. I said, let them in. The man's voice was like ice cracking across a frozen lake, quiet but impossible to ignore. The gate swung open with a creak that echoed into the cold night. The twins didn't move. Nessa felt Lily's hand tremble in hers. They had been chased away too many times to believe kindness could be real. But the warmth pouring from the mansion was too much to resist. They stepped forward, their feet leaving small, uneven prints in the snow. The front doors swung open before they could knock, spilling golden light onto the snowy steps. A man stood at the top of the grand staircase, the same man from the balcony. His black suit was crisp, his silver hair perfectly in place. He looked like he belonged in one of those magazines their mother used to flip through at the laundromat, the kind that showed people in fancy cars and million-dollar houses. But his face, Nessa didn't understand what she saw there. Shock, pain, terror, like someone who had seen a ghost. The glass in his hand, a heavy tumbler filled with amber liquid, slipped from his fingers, shattering against the marble floor. For a moment, the entire party paused. Conversations died, music faltered, and all eyes turned to the man who, until that moment, had been the unshakable king of his castle. He stumbled forward, his polished shoes crunching over broken glass, his breath coming fast and uneven. Nessa instinctively stepped in front of Lily, shielding her sister with her small frame. The man's blue eyes locked onto theirs, and he dropped to his knees right there on the marble floor. No, he whispered, voice ragged. It's not possible. Lily squeezed Nessa's hand, confused and frightened. Why's he looking at us like that? I don't know, Nessa whispered back, her stomach twisting with unease. The man's hands trembled as they reached out toward them, but he didn't touch them. His eyes filled with something that looked like grief, old grief, the kind that never fades, only burrows deeper with time. You're not them, he murmured, his voice breaking on the words. Nessa didn't understand what he meant. All she knew was that for the first time in her life, someone was looking at them like they mattered. And for some reason, it terrified her. Because in that moment, she realized something. This wasn't just kindness. This was something else entirely. And whatever it was about to change everything. The weight of ghosts, the silence that followed could have swallowed the entire mansion. Nessa stood rooted at the bottom of the grand staircase, her small, scuffed shoes sinking into the plush marble floor. Lily's trembling fingers clutched at Nessa's wrist, her frightened breath puffing in tiny clouds between them. Around them, the glittering guests in gowns and tailored suits stood frozen, as though someone had pressed pause on the perfect party scene. Champagne flutes hung in midair, laughter extinguished in half-formed syllables. At the top of the stairs, the man in the suit, this stranger who was somehow not a stranger at all, was on his knees, shards of broken crystal sparkling around him like fallen stars. His face was pale, his knuckles white against the polished banister, but his blue eyes, sharp, piercing, haunted, never left the twins. Those eyes looked through them, past them, as if he were seeing not who they were, but who they reminded him of. He wasn't looking at Nessa and Lily. He was seeing ghosts. Lily, oblivious to the weight of whatever storm was brewing in this man's mind, took a step forward. Please, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're sorry if we did something wrong. We're just hungry." The man flinched, as though the sound of her voice physically hurt him. From somewhere near the edge of the room, a woman's voice rang out, brittle with discomfort. "Victor, what on earth is going on?" Victor. That was his name. Nessa tucked it away, filing it under things to remember if they needed to make a run for it. But the man, Victor, didn't answer the woman. He didn't move. His breath came in short, shallow bursts, and his trembling hands gripped the rail, as though it was the only thing keeping him upright. Nessa's instincts screamed to get out. They didn't belong here, in this shining house of glass and gold. It was too warm, too bright, too fragile for kids like them, who knew only the hardness of alleyways and the constant hunger gnawing at their bellies. She reached for Lily's hand, ready to pull her back into the cold night, but the butler, an older man with a kind, weathered face, stepped between them and the door. His voice was low, gentle, but firm. "Come with me, children." Lily hesitated, torn between the warmth inside and the icy wind pressing against the still-open doors. Nessa tugged her sister's sleeve. "Let's go." But Lily's feet stayed planted. Her hunger was stronger than her fear. Nessa's stomach clenched, but she couldn't leave her sister. With one last wary glance at Victor, still frozen at the top of the stairs, she followed the butler down the hall, her steps hesitant, her senses on high alert. The sitting room was almost too beautiful to touch. The fire crackled in a massive stone hearth, sending flickering light across shelves, lined with books that looked too fancy to read. The carpet was thick underfoot, and the furniture gleamed with polished wood and rich fabric. There was even a plate of cookies on the side table, untouched. Lily darted toward them without hesitation, grabbing one with both hands, her teeth sinking into the soft dough, like it was the first real food she'd had in days. Nessa stood by the door, arms crossed over her thin chest, watching the hallway for any sign of trouble. "Sit," the butler said gently, gesturing to the overstuffed couch. "You're safe here." Nessa didn't believe him. But the warmth of the fire, the scent of cookies, and the weight of her sister's exhaustion finally won. She sank into the corner of the couch, pulling her knees up to her chest, eyes never leaving the door. "Where's the man?" Lily asked, her mouth full. "The one who was staring at us." The butler's expression flickered, something unreadable passing through his eyes before smoothing into polite neutrality. "Mr. Callahan will be along shortly." Victor Callahan. The name felt familiar, but Nessa couldn't place it. It was the kind of name you heard on the news when they talked about stock markets and luxury hotels. It was a name too big, too important for kids like them. Why was he looking at us like that? Lily asked, licking sugar from her fingers. "Did we do something wrong?" The butler hesitated. "No, child," he said softly. "You didn't do anything wrong." Then why did he look so broken? Nessa didn't ask the question aloud, but it lodged itself deep in her chest, heavy and cold. Victor stood in his study, his back to the door, one hand braced against the glass of the window. The snow outside reflected the glow of the city lights, 1,000 tiny stars caught in the darkness. His reflection stared back at him, hollow-eyed, gray at the temples, a stranger in his own skin. They couldn't be real. But they were. The twins. Their faces. His daughters. No. His mind rebelled against the thought even as his heart seized with the impossible ache of it. His daughters were gone. 8 years ago, on a rain-slick highway, a truck crossed the median. A car crushed beyond recognition. 2 tiny coffins lowered into the earth on a cold, gray morning. His wife had stood beside him, silent, empty-eyed, while the preacher spoke words neither of them heard. He buried them. He had buried them. Victor's hand curled into a fist, pressing hard against the glass. These girls weren't them. But they were close enough to tear him in half. Their eyes, their hair, even the way the older one stood slightly in front of the younger, protective and wary. It was too much. The ghosts of his daughters stood in his hall, flesh and blood, and shivering with cold. And it was his fault. Not for the accident. No, that was fate's cruelty. But for everything after. For burying himself in work. For building walls so high no one could climb them. For making his fortune a fortress to keep out the pain, and, in doing so, keeping out everything else. His company had become a machine, cold and relentless, grinding through lives like paper in a shredder. Those eviction notices. The hundreds of signatures he'd scrawled without reading the names. What if? He squeezed his eyes shut, breath hitching. What if he put them on the street? What if the very empire he built to protect himself had destroyed someone else? Someone who carried a piece of his past. A knock at the door dragged him from his spiral. The butler's voice, steady as always. "Sir, the children are settled in the blue room." Victor's throat closed. He couldn't speak. "Would you like me to?" "No," Victor croaked. "I'll go." Nessa sat cross-legged on the wide bed, her arms around Lily, who had curled against her side, fast asleep. The fire in the small guest room's fireplace had burned low, casting shadows that danced across the walls. The door creaked open, and Victor stood there, silhouetted against the light from the hall. Nessa stiffened, her hand tightening on the thin blanket covering Lily. Victor took a step inside, his movements slow, careful, like someone approaching a wounded animal. "I won't hurt you," he said softly. Nessa didn't answer. He knelt beside the bed, his eyes tracing the curve of Lily's cheek, the way her small hand clutched at Nessa's sleeve even in sleep. His hand hovered for a moment, trembling, before dropping back to his side. "Do you have anyone?" he asked. Nessa's chin lifted slightly, her pride flaring despite the fear. "We have each other." A ghost of a smile flickered across Victor's face, painful and fleeting. "That's good," he said softly. "That's very good." There was a long pause, filled only by the crackle of the dying fire. Then, just before he stood, his voice dropped to a whisper. "I'm sorry." Nessa didn't know what he meant. Not yet. But something in the way he said it made her heart twist, because it sounded like a man apologizing for far more than just a broken glass or a cold welcome. It sounded like the kind of sorry that came after years of silence, the kind of sorry that could change everything. Beneath the surface, the soft tick of the antique clock was the only sound in the dimly lit room. Nessa lay wide awake, her sister's steady breathing warming her side. Lily slept deeply, curled against her like she had every night since their world crumbled beneath them. Even in sleep, Lily's fingers clutched Nessa's sleeve, her subconscious refusing to let go of the only certainty they had left, each other. The bed was too soft, the room too warm, the air too fragrant with the smell of lavender soap and polished wood. Everything about this house felt unreal, like stepping through a wardrobe into a storybook. The firelight flickered low in the hearth, sending golden shadows dancing along the walls. It should have been comforting. It wasn't. Nessa couldn't forget the look in Victor Callahan's eyes, that sharp mix of disbelief, recognition, and grief. It was the way someone looks at a ghost, and even though she didn't know why, she knew without question that somehow, for some reason, he knew them, or thought he did. Nessa had learned long ago to trust her instincts. They had kept her and Lily safe through sleepless nights in bus stations, through slippery men who offered candy in exchange for favors, through the countless times they were chased off sidewalks just for existing. The instinct rising in her now was the same. Something was wrong here. Something bigger than the food, the fancy room, the soft bed. She slipped out from under the thick covers, her feet hitting the warm carpet, and crept silently toward the heavy wooden door. The house had gone quiet. The Christmas music had stopped, the laughter and clinking glasses of the guests long gone. Even the guards outside had retreated from the cold, their heavy boots no longer crunching in the snow. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with paintings that probably cost more than her old apartment. Nessa's reflection followed her in the glossy wood paneling, a thin girl in clothes too small, hair tangled and dull from days without washing. She followed the faint flicker of light at the end of the hall. A door stood slightly ajar. The study. Nessa pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering as she peeked through the gap. Victor Callahan sat slumped at a massive mahogany desk, his face in his hands, fingers pressed into his temples as if trying to keep his skull from splitting open. Papers were scattered across the desk. Photos, documents, letters, and in the center, a single photograph, its edges worn, its surface marred by what looked like water stains. Nessa couldn't see the image, but she didn't have to. She knew. The way his shoulders shook, the way his breath hitched every few seconds. This was a man who knew loss. A man grieving ghosts. She should have gone back to bed. Should have pulled the door shut and pretended they were just two homeless kids who'd stumbled into a rich man's house for a warm meal. But something kept her rooted there. It was the way his hands trembled. It was the way his carefully built mask had crumbled when he saw them. Nessa took a step back, her foot brushing against something soft, a small rug in the hallway. The slight scuff made Victor's head snap up, his red-rimmed eyes locking onto the door. "Who's there?" Nessa froze. "Come in," his voice said, low but steady. "I know you're there." She could have run, but she didn't. She stepped inside. Victor straightened slightly, wiping the heel of his hand across his face, as if embarrassed to be caught so vulnerable. His suit jacket hung over the back of the chair, his tie loosened, sleeves pushed up to reveal arms leaner than she would have expected. He wasn't the image of power she'd seen earlier. Here, he looked. Smaller. Human. "You should be asleep," he said softly. Nessa didn't answer. Her eyes flicked to the desk, to the papers strewn across its surface. One stood out. A torn eviction notice, her mother's name scrawled at the top in neat black ink. "Why do you have that?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Victor followed her gaze, his expression shifting from surprise to something like shame. He didn't speak for a long moment, fingers tapping a slow rhythm against the edge of the desk. Finally, he said, "Because it's my fault." Nessa's brow furrowed. "What?" Victor's throat worked as he swallowed, his gaze dropping to the desk. "The building your mother lived in. My company owns it. I signed the order that had her evicted." The words landed like a slap. Nessa's hands curled into fists. "You." Her voice broke, sharp and raw. "You threw us out." Victor's fingers curled around the edge of the desk until his knuckles went white. "I didn't know," he said softly. "I signed dozens of those notices every week. I didn't know her name until tonight." The weight of it settled in Nessa's chest, cold and crushing. "You didn't know," she repeated bitterly. "Because you didn't care." Victor flinched. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unsaid. Finally, Victor reached for the worn photograph at the center of the desk and held it out to her. His hand trembled slightly as he offered it. Nessa hesitated, then took the photo. It was old, edges curled, the colors slightly faded. In it, two little girls with identical faces grinned up at the camera, their arms wrapped around each other, their blonde hair tangled in the wind. They weren't Nessa and Lily, but they could have been. The girls in the picture were a little younger, their cheeks rounder, their eyes brighter with the safety of knowing they were loved. But the resemblance was haunting. "They were my daughters," Victor said quietly. "Melaine and Clara." The names meant nothing to Nessa, but the grief in his voice was unmistakable. "They died," he said, his voice catching on the word. 8 years ago." Nessa's fingers tightened on the photo. He was looking at ghosts. "But we're not them," she said firmly. Victor's smile was faint, a ghost of something that had long since withered. "I know." "Then why are we here?" Her voice rose, frustration sharpening the edges of her words. "What do you want from us?" Victor's hand rose to his chest, fingers brushing a spot over his heart, as though trying to soothe something deep beneath his skin. "Because I couldn't save them," he said quietly. "But maybe I can save you." Nessa's throat closed, her heart pounding against her ribs, a fierce war between anger and something more dangerous. Hope. She didn't want to believe him. People like Victor Callahan didn't help kids like her. But there was something in his face, raw, broken, too vulnerable for someone who owned a house like this. "Where's our mom?" she asked suddenly. Victor's jaw tightened. "I'm trying to find her." Nessa took a step back, suddenly feeling too small in this too big room with this too powerful man. "We don't need saving." Victor's smile was sad. "I think you do." Before Nessa could respond, Lily's small voice came from the hall. "Nessa." Victor's eyes flicked past her to the doorway where Lily stood, her hair tangled from sleep, her small hands clutching the hem of her borrowed pajamas. "Go back to bed, Lily," Nessa said, forcing calm into her voice. Lily's gaze drifted past her sister to Victor, her brow furrowing. "Why are you sad?" Victor inhaled sharply. "Because I made mistakes," he said softly. Lily stepped into the room, her small feet silent on the carpet. "Everybody makes mistakes." Victor's throat worked as he swallowed. "Not like mine." Lily tilted her head. "Did you say sorry?" Nessa's heart clenched. Victor's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm trying." Lily considered this, then walked over and held out her hand. Victor stared at it, confused. "You can hold my hand," Lily said solemnly. "Sometimes that helps." Victor's breath hitched. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, his large hand closed around hers, his fingers trembling. Nessa didn't know what to do with the knot in her chest. Anger, confusion, and something warmer, more fragile. Hope. The kind that could break her if she let it grow. Fractured hearts and shattered mirrors. The storm outside grew stronger overnight. Heavy winds howling against the mansion's windows, rattling the panes like an impatient visitor demanding entry. Nessa barely slept, her mind too full of unanswered questions and unfamiliar fears. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Victor's face, that raw, broken expression that spoke of guilt far deeper than a missed meal or a signed eviction notice. She didn't trust him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But Lily, sweet, hopeful Lily, had curled up in Victor's lap on the couch in the sitting room after their strange encounter, her little head resting against his chest, like they'd known each other forever. Nessa had watched, her stomach twisting with something she couldn't name. Anger, fear, jealousy, maybe all of it. Victor hadn't pulled away. He'd just held Lily, his large hand resting lightly on her back, as if afraid to hold on too tightly, or afraid to let go. The mansion's past. Another layer unfolds. The next morning, the mansion's mood had shifted. The guests were gone. The decorations felt too bright for the silence that filled the halls. Even the butler, usually composed and graceful, moved with a quietness that seemed more like mourning than service. Nessa sat at the massive dining table, her fingers wrapped around a mug of hot cocoa she didn't want. Across from her, Lily happily demolished a stack of pancakes, syrup dotting her chin. Every few bites, she leaned over to show Nessa a piece of fruit shaped like a star or a smiley face, proudly arranged by the housekeeper, Margaret. Victor hadn't joined them. That was fine with Nessa. She wanted him far away, where his grief and his guilt couldn't infect their fragile peace. Still, when Margaret appeared with a folded note in her hand, Nessa's stomach clenched. "Mr. Callahan asked if you'd join him in the study," Margaret said softly, her kind eyes scanning Nessa's face. "Just you." Lily looked up from her plate, cheeks puffed with pancake. "Can I come?" Margaret smiled. "Not this time, sweetheart." Nessa stood, her chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. Her fists clenched at her sides. She didn't want to be summoned like some servant. She didn't want to walk into his fancy study and sit in his fancy chair and pretend they belonged here. But she also wanted answers. "Fine," she muttered and followed Margaret down the hall. A broken man's confession. Victor's study felt even darker than before. The fire had burned down to faint embers, the gray sky pressing against the windows like a living thing. Victor stood at the window, his hands in his pockets, his reflection a ghost in the glass. "Have a seat," he said without turning around. Nessa stayed standing. Victor sighed. "I'm not going to hurt you." "That's what they all say," Nessa replied, her voice sharp. "Right before they do." He turned, and for the first time, she noticed how tired he looked. The deep grooves around his mouth, the dark smudges under his eyes. It made him look older than he probably was, like someone who'd been carrying too much for too long. "I need to tell you something," he said. "I don't care." "You should." Nessa's arms crossed over her chest, a thin barrier between herself and whatever confession he was about to unload. "Fine. Say what you want." Victor walked to his desk and picked up a thin manila folder. He held it out to her. "This is your mother's eviction file." Nessa's fingers itched to snatch it, but she forced herself to stay still. "Why do you have that?" "Because I signed it." "You already said that." Victor's jaw tightened. "I'm not just talking about her eviction. I'm talking about everything." Nessa's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Victor opened the folder, pulling out a grainy black and white photo clipped to the first page. Nessa stepped closer despite herself. The photo showed a woman, younger, thinner, but unmistakably their mother. Her hair was shorter, her smile brighter. "This was taken almost 10 years ago," Victor said quietly. "Her name was Camille Laurent." Nessa's breath caught in her throat. She knew her mother's first name was Camille, but Laurent, that wasn't the name on the eviction notice. "She changed her last name when she left," Victor said, answering her unspoken question. "She wanted to disappear." Nessa's knees felt weak. "Why?" Victor set the photo down, his hands pressing flat against the desk, like it was the only thing holding him up. "Because of me." The words were quiet, but they hit like thunder. "What did you do to her?" Nessa demanded, her voice rising. Victor's face twisted in something between grief and shame. "I loved her." Nessa's stomach flipped. "That doesn't make sense." "I loved her," Victor repeated, "but not enough to choose her over my career. Not enough to be the man she needed me to be." He walked to the window, the weight of memory pressing down on his shoulders. "We were young when we met. I was ambitious, hungry for success. Camille, she believed in me, even when I didn't deserve it. But every year, every promotion, every deal, it took me further away from her." His voice cracked. "She told me she was pregnant. I was in the middle of closing the biggest deal of my life. I told her I couldn't. I wasn't ready." Nessa's breath caught in her throat. "She left," Victor said softly, "and I let her." The silence was deafening. "Are you saying?" Nessa's voice shook. "Your hour." Victor turned, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Yes." The word hit her like a blow, sending her reeling back a step. "No," she whispered. "No, you're lying." "I'm not." His voice was soft, but unshakable. "I've already ordered the DNA test, but I don't need the results to know." Nessa's heart pounded so hard it hurt. All her life, their father had been a ghost, a shadow her mother never spoke about. And now, here he was, not a monster, but a broken man, drowning in guilt and regret. "No," she said again, shaking her head. "You left us. You left her." "I know." His voice cracked. "And I will spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." Nessa's fists shook. "You think money fixes everything." "No." His voice was so quiet she almost didn't hear it. "But I'm here now." She wanted to hate him. She wanted to scream, to hit, to tear through this fancy house and rip it apart the way his absence had ripped through her life. But Lily's voice echoed in her head. "Everybody makes mistakes." The room blurred with tears she refused to shed. "You don't deserve us," she said. "I know. You can't fix this." "I know." But when she turned to leave, he didn't stop her. And that, more than anything, made her pause. A mother's trail. That night, Nessa lay awake beside Lily, staring at the ceiling. Her mind spun, memories and doubts tangling together like frayed string. Her mother's tired face, the eviction, the hungry nights, and Victor, her father, a man drowning in his own ghosts. When sleep finally came, it was restless and dark. Morning brought fresh snow and a knock at the door. Margaret stood there, holding a letter with a trembling hand. "Mr. Callahan wanted you to have this." Nessa opened it with numb fingers. It was a list. Shelters, hospitals, soup kitchens, all the places Victor's investigators had searched for Camille Laurent. At the bottom, one word: unfound. Nessa's chest ached. Victor might have been a terrible father, but he hadn't stopped looking. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't a lost cause. "Do you think she's out there?" Lily's soft voice broke through the silence. Nessa looked out at the snow-covered world. "I don't know," she whispered, but somewhere, in the cold, a door was opening. And maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to bring her home. Footprints in the snow. The snow had stopped falling sometime before dawn, leaving a soft, undisturbed blanket of white stretching from the front gates of Victor Callahan's estate to the tree-lined street beyond. The world looked peaceful, but Nessa knew better. Snow could cover a lot of things. Garbage, footprints, even the past, but it couldn't erase them. She stood at the frost-covered window, her fingers resting against the cold glass. Outside, the world glowed under the thin morning sun, the sky pale and uncertain. Lily's soft breathing filled the silence behind her, a familiar comfort in a world that still felt like it was balanced on a knife's edge. Their father. The word stuck in her throat like a bone. She hadn't said it out loud yet. She couldn't. Victor Callahan was a name, a powerful, dangerous name. But now that name belonged to something smaller, more fragile. A man who had made the kind of mistakes you don't come back from. And yet, somehow, he was still here, still trying. The list he'd given her lay folded beside the bed, the paper creased and softened from where Nessa had held it too tightly the night before. It was proof that he hadn't just looked for Camille because of guilt or duty. He had looked for her because some part of him, no matter how buried, still cared. And now, Nessa realized, she had to care too, whether she wanted to or not. The first step. Victor was already waiting at the bottom of the grand staircase when Nessa appeared. His coat was buttoned up, scarf knotted tightly around his throat, and there was something almost vulnerable in the way he stood, as if he expected her not to show up at all. "Ready?" he asked. "No," Nessa replied honestly, "but let's go anyway." They were meeting Daniel Grayson, Victor's personal investigator, at a small diner on the east side of town. Nessa hated riding in Victor's sleek black car, the leather seats too soft beneath her, the whole vehicle smelling like money and privilege. But Lily had curled up beside her, humming Christmas songs under her breath, and the warmth of her sister's presence grounded her. The city was different from inside a car. Warmer, more distant. When you walked everywhere, you felt the cracks in the sidewalk beneath your shoes, felt every gust of wind through thin coats, noticed every sideways glance from people who saw you and decided not to help. From the back seat of a Mercedes, the world looked quieter, like a picture hanging in a gallery, something to be observed, not touched. Nessa hated it. Victor drove in silence, his hands gripping the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. She wondered if he was afraid to say the wrong thing, or maybe afraid to say anything at all. The map of a mother's life. Daniel Grayson was older than Nessa expected, with thinning hair and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. He spread a map out on the table between them, lines drawn in red ink, tiny notes scrawled along the margins. "This," Daniel said, tapping the paper, "is every shelter Camille stayed at in the last 2 years." Nessa leaned forward, her stomach tight. There were so many. "She moved a lot," Daniel continued. "Never stayed anywhere more than a few nights, sometimes less." "Why?" Nessa asked, her voice sharper than she meant. Daniel's mouth tightened, because she was scared. Victor flinched at that, but Nessa's attention was locked on the map. Scared of what? Or who? We know she was evicted from her last apartment, Daniel went on. But there's a gap of about 3 weeks after that where we lost track of her completely. Then she turned up at a clinic downtown sick. She stayed one night. Then she was gone again. Nessa swallowed hard. That was weeks ago. Daniel nodded. There's been no sign of her since. A cold knot formed in Nessa's chest. Her mother was good at hiding. Nessa knew that better than anyone. But this was different. This wasn't just hiding from bad landlords or nosy social workers. This felt like something darker. Victor's voice broke through her thoughts. We'll find her. Nessa wanted to believe him. But hope was dangerous. The shelter circuit. They started at Hope Haven, the nearest shelter on the list. The woman at the front desk remembered Camille, remembered her quiet voice, her limp, the way she always kept one eye on the door. She never told us why she left so suddenly, the woman said, her brow furrowed with concern. 1 minute she was here, the next her bed was empty. Nessa could see the pity in her eyes, the way the woman's gaze drifted toward her and Lily. Poor kids, they'd heard it before. Did she say anything about where she was going? Victor asked. The woman shook her head. No, but she mentioned someone was following her. Nessa's stomach flipped. Following her. She wouldn't say who, the woman said softly. Just that she couldn't stay in one place too long. Lily tugged on Nessa's sleeve, her brow furrowed. Was Mama running away? Nessa's throat tightened. I don't know. Piecing together the trail. Each shelter told a similar story. Camille arrived, stayed briefly, then vanished. Sometimes she left in the middle of the night. Sometimes she barely spoke to anyone. She always asked the same questions. Were there cameras outside? Did anyone ask for her by name? She was terrified, Daniel murmured after the 5th stop, like she thought someone was hunting her. Victor's expression darkened. Was someone? Daniel didn't answer right away. But Nessa knew. Some ghosts don't rest. A name from the past. It was at a shelter on the far edge of the city, a place where the walls were patched with old plywood and the beds were little more than worn mattresses on the floor, where they got their first real lead. The man at the front desk, grizzled and missing 2 fingers, remembered Camille well. She was looking for someone, he said, chewing on a toothpick. Asked if anyone named Keller had been through. Victor's knuckles tightened against the table. Keller. Nessa glanced between them. Who's Keller? Victor's jaw worked, like he was chewing on something sharp. An old associate. Daniel leaned in. Keller used to work for Victor, years ago. He was part of security. What does that have to do with my mom? Nessa demanded. Victor's silence was answer enough. What's left unsaid? That night, back at the mansion, Nessa stood in front of the Christmas tree, its twinkling lights too cheerful, too bright. Lily was asleep upstairs, curled in a bed too soft, wrapped in warmth they'd never known before. Victor stood across the room, nursing a glass of water like it might drown his demons. Who is Keller? Nessa asked softly. Victor didn't look at her. A mistake. That's not an answer. Victor sighed, setting the glass down. After Camille left, I didn't handle it well. I made bad choices, hired bad people to make problems disappear. Nessa's stomach churned. You sent someone after her. I didn't know, Victor said, voice cracking. I swear, I thought I was cleaning up loose ends. I didn't know they'd go after her. Nessa's fists clenched. So now she's running for her life. Victor's eyes met hers, and the guilt there was too big for her to hold. Yes, the truth is a wound. Nessa wanted to scream, wanted to break something, wanted to hurt him the way his decisions had hurt them. But instead, she sat down on the floor beside the tree, hugging her knees to her chest. Can you fix it? She asked, voice small. I don't know, Victor admitted, but I'll die trying. Nessa's throat burned, but she nodded once. That would have to be enough. For now. The road home. The cold air bit at Nessa's skin as she stood just outside the grand front door of Victor Callahan's mansion, the silence of the snow-covered estate stretching around her like a heavy blanket. The wind stirred, brushing against her face and tangling her hair as she stared at the sky, watching her breath cloud the air. It was strange how beautiful the world could look, even when everything inside her felt like it was breaking apart. She had learned the truth now. Not all of it, but enough. Enough to know her mother wasn't just running from poverty or bad luck. She was running from him. From Victor Callahan's past mistakes, the shadows that followed men like him long after they left the boardroom. And somehow, she and Lily were caught in the middle of it all. Behind her, Victor stood in the doorway. He hadn't spoken since their conversation the night before, since he'd admitted how deeply his guilt ran. Nessa didn't know if she hated him or pitied him. Maybe both. "Are you ready?" His voice was hoarse, as though every word was pulled from deep inside. Nessa's fingers curled inside her thin gloves. "No," she said honestly, "but let's go." The final clue. Daniel Grayson had spent the night digging. Every scrap of paper, every surveillance feed, every note from shelters and clinics, piecing together Camille's fractured trail. By morning, he had found a new lead. "Street Brigades," he said, his fingers tapping a grainy photo of a rundown church on the far end of the city. "They have a small soup kitchen in the basement. She was there 4 days ago." Nessa's heart leaked into her throat. 4 days. That was the closest they'd gotten. Any sign of killer? Victor's voice was low. Daniel's mouth thinned. Nothing concrete, but someone was asking about her. Victor's jaw tightened, the muscle ticking near his temple. "We need to find her first." Street Brigades. The church sat on the edge of a crumbling block, sagging under the weight of too many winters and not enough repairs. Snow gathered in drifts along the cracked sidewalk, and a faded wooden sign swung in the wind. "It's paint peeling." The basement door was half open when they arrived, the smell of stale coffee and soup mingling with the cold air. Inside, a handful of men and women huddled at folding tables, their coats still on, hands wrapped around warm cuffs. A volunteer, a thin woman with tired eyes, met them at the door. "We're looking for someone," Victor said, his voice careful, measured. "Her name is Camille Laurent." The woman's brows lifted. Camille. Her eyes flicked to Nessa and Lily, who clung to her sister's hand. "She was here a few nights ago." "Is she still here?" Nessa asked, her voice too loud, too desperate. The woman shook her head. "She left in a hurry. Said someone was following her." Nessa's stomach churned. "Did she say where she was going?" The volunteer hesitated, then leaned closer. "There's an old shelter near the rail yard. Not official, just some empty building squatters use. She mentioned it once, said it was her last resort." Victor's hand settled lightly on Nessa's shoulder. "Let's go." The ghost building. The air grew colder as they neared the rail yard, the snow untouched in long stretches where no one dared to walk. Graffiti-covered walls stood like silent sentinels, windows boarded up or shattered, leaving black holes in the building's faces. Nessa held Lily's hand tight, her heart pounding. This felt wrong. The world felt too quiet, the silence stretching too far. They found the building, a squat, concrete husk sagging beneath years of neglect. A broken door hung crooked on its hinges, the darkness inside swallowing what little daylight crept through the clouds. "Stay close," Victor said, his voice low but firm. The floor creaked beneath their feet as they stepped inside. Trash littered the ground. Old blankets, broken bottles, scraps of paper. A faint trail of footprints led deeper into the building. "Camille." Victor's voice echoed off the bare walls. There was no answer. Lily's fingers dug into Nessa's palm. "What if she's not here?" "We keep looking," Nessa whispered. "Found." They found her huddled in the corner of the second floor, wrapped in a tattered blanket, her face pale and her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her hair was dull and tangled, her hands trembling in the cold, but her eyes, when they flickered open, were unmistakable. "Mom." Lily broke free and ran, flinging herself into Camille's arms. Camille gasped, her arms curling around her daughter automatically, even as tears filled her eyes. "Lily. Oh, my baby." Nessa stood frozen, her chest tight with so many emotions she couldn't name them all. Relief, anger, guilt, hope, all of it at once. Camille's eyes lifted, locking onto Victor. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Camille's voice, raw and trembling. "What are you doing here?" Victor took a step forward, then stopped. "Looking for you." The words hung in the cold air, fragile and uncertain. Camille's eyes filled with something sharp. Anger, fear, maybe both. "You don't get to do that. You don't get to show up now." "I know," Victor said softly. "But I'm here anyway." The hardest conversations. They moved to a nearby motel, where the heat worked and the blankets were clean. Camille sat on the edge of the bed, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea, while Nessa and Lily curled together on the other bed, watching silently. Victor stood near the window, the snow outside swirling against the glass. "I didn't know," Victor said finally, his voice low. "Not about the eviction. Not about Keller. I didn't know how bad it had gotten." Camille's fingers tightened around the cup. "You didn't want to know." Victor flinched. "After I left, I kept waiting for you to come after me," Camille said, her voice cracking. "But you never did. I thought," Victor swallowed hard, "I thought you were better off without me." Camille shook her head. "We weren't." Silence settled over the room like fresh snow, soft, heavy, hiding all the broken things beneath it. "Why was Keller after you?" Nessa's voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet. Camille's hands trembled. "He wasn't supposed to. After I left, Victor's associates thought I knew too much. They wanted to make sure I stayed quiet." Victor's jaw clenched. "I never ordered that." "I know," Camille said softly. "But you let men like Keller into your world. And once they're in, you can't always control them." Victor's hands curled into fists at his sides. "He'll never touch you again." Camille looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in years. "That's what you said before. A choice." The next morning, Victor stood beside his car, the engine idling. Nessa stood with Lily, their bags packed, Camille at their side. The air was thick with unspoken things. "I know I can't fix the past," Victor said, "but I want to try." Camille's arms wrapped around her daughter's shoulders, her fingers brushing Nessa's hair like she was memorizing the feel of it. "I don't know if I can trust you." Victor nodded. "I'll earn it." Camille exhaled slowly. "We need time." "You'll have it," Victor promised. Lily's small voice broke through. "Can we see you again?" Victor knelt, his hands resting gently on Lily's shoulders. "As much as you want." Nessa watched her mother's face, saw the hesitation, the fear, but also something else. Hope, fragile and flickering, but there. "Okay," Camille said softly. It wasn't a promise, but it was a start. Home is what you make it. Weeks later, in a small rented house with a creaky floor and peeling wallpaper, Nessa sat beside Lily at the kitchen table, coloring. A knock sounded at the door. Victor stood there, holding a small box wrapped in plain brown paper. "It's not much," he said. Nessa opened it, her breath catching. Inside was a small silver frame holding a photo. The four of them, taken at the motel before they'd left. Not perfect, but together. "We're trying," Victor said. Nessa smiled, just a little. "Yeah," she said, "we are. And sometimes, that's enough."